For the past several weeks in our church, we've been discussing this idea of origins, of where we come from and what our ultimate purpose is. And the title of this week's Bible study lesson is Through a Glass Darkly. There was always this argument growing up in my family and my neighborhood. What would you rather have if you could only pick one? Would you rather have street smarts or book smarts? A street smarts person was someone who was known to be street savvy. They could survive outdoors. They could survive in their neighborhoods. They didn't back down from conflict. They knew when they were getting hustled or when there was a good deal versus a bad deal. They knew everyone in the neighborhood, and they could survive well. A book smarts person didn't have the same type of resume, as it were. Now, a book smarts person could survive in the classroom. They did well in their assignments and their homework. But when it came down to surviving on the streets, when it came down to not being hustled, when it came down to sticking up for yourself, or even being able to fight, it's usually the book smarts person that came up on the short end of the stick. So the conversation continued to ensue. I want to be a street smarts person because I want to protect myself or survive on the streets or survive under any situation. I want to be a book smarts person because I'll be able to excel academically and get a good job and get a good salary. And some people say, I'm book smarts and I'm street smarts. And even though the debate continues till today. But the truth is, if you look at what Paul says about the matter, it doesn't matter if you're book smarts or you're street smarts. If neither of those indicators of smartness are filtered through your relationship with God. This is how he puts it. He says, the wisdom of this world is foolishness in God's sight. So you could be the smartest person, the bravest person, the most connected person in your neighborhood. You can know the ins and outs of your neighborhood. You could have your ear to what's going on in the neighborhood to stay out of trouble or to take advantage of it. Or you could be the best person in the classroom. You could be the valedictorian. You could be the head of the class. You could have the highest GPA. If neither one of those things are filtered through or brings you closer to God, Paul says it's foolishness. The wisdom of this world is foolishness in God's sight. As it is written, he catches the wise in their craftiness. And sometimes, and I'm guilty of this, sometimes I've tried to outsmart God, maybe from a streetwise perspective or even from an academic perspective. We try to outsmart God, but Paul says that's foolishness. The wisdom that we were able to glean from our life experiences is a drop in the bucket, and it's folly. It's nothing compared to the understanding that God has. So we come up with the idea of seeing darkly, and that's taken from a passage in 1 Corinthians that we'll get to later. But you have to ask yourself, even though we've made these advances in technology, we've made these advances in society, we've made all these connections, we have the media 24/7 telling us what's going on and keeping us connected, we have our phones, we have social media, we're still limited in our understanding of who God is and how to relate to him. And there are three basic reasons why this is so. The first reason why we see through a glass darkly is because we live in a different world. There was a show that used to come on, I think in the 90s, it was called A Different World. And the theme song says you're living in a different world, or it's a different world from where you come from. If you look at the Genesis account, Genesis 3:17 and Genesis chapter 4, it's clear that we live in a different world. In Genesis 3:17, Adam was cursed because he chose to sin and follow after Eve. And before, we could eat from every tree of the garden, but now man had to work hard, and from the sweat of his brow and from toiling the ground, he was able to feed himself. And then Genesis chapter 4, after the whole Cain and Abel incident where Cain murders Abel, the ground and the land are cursed even more. It used to be man would work the ground and it would yield its strength. As the Bible account reads, the ground or the earth would yield its strength or its bounty to man. Now in Genesis chapter 4, man has to work even harder to produce what he needs to take care of his family. So the context and the makeup of the world changed. It's a harsher environment. And as the years pass, we know morally the world is even harsher to live in now. So we're in a different world than the original world that God created for us. So even today, when we look at our world and we're studying nature and the amazing facets of nature, we're studying nature that's been marred by sin and degradation. The second reason why we see through a glass darkly, or why we don't have a complete picture of our origins and our relationship with God, is that we're different people. Psalm 90:10 says we're afforded threescore and ten. Well, we know a score is 20 years. So if we're afforded threescore, that's 60 plus 10, 70 years, the psalmist says. We get 70 years, and by reason of strength, a few years more. That our bodies are not the same. If you look at the stories of some of the people who lived before the flood, people lived hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and they had a capacity to learn and to grow that far outweighs our capacity, even with our technology, far outweighs the capacity that we have today. We're just different people. We're far reduced in our strength and our mental capacity and some of the things that we're able to do as compared to our foreparents, our forefathers. And the third reason is that we live in a context. It's hard to see because we live in a context of different relationships. We know the marriage relationship in the Garden of Eden was to reflect the relationship, the Trinity relationship. That family relationship was to affect the Trinity relationship. But 1 Peter 5:8 tells us that our enemy, the devil, Satan, is walking around like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. And ever since the context of the relationship changed in heaven with Lucifer, whose name was changed to Satan, or adversary, since the context of that relationship with God has changed, Satan has made it his point, his agenda, his mission to change the context of our relationships with God and our relationships with each other. Jesus says of his disciples, they'll know that you follow me by the love that you have for each other. And it's always a task in churches and in families to love each other. The way that we love each other is reflective of our relationship with God. So because we live in a different world, because we are different people, and because the context of our relationships are different, it's hard for us to really have a good understanding of where we come from and how we're really supposed to interact with God. Paul puts it this way, though, in 1 Corinthians 13:12. He says, "For now we see through a glass darkly." Remember, we see darkly because we live in a different world. Sin has really messed this thing up. We see darkly because we're different people. Sin has cut off our life expectancy and our ability to live and grow and excel and to think. Our capacity is severely limited, and sin has cut off or changed the dynamics of our relationship with other people. And the prince of the power of this world, Lucifer, is really behind trying to make our relationships not reflect a relationship or the character of God. But Paul says, now we see through a glass darkly, but then we shall see face to face. Now we know in part. We have it's limited what we know, but there will come a time when we'll be able to know and be able to understand completely.